Hello and welcome to Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival for 2022. Welcome also to those of you at home joining on Zoom. We have viewers throughout New South Wales who will be watching from their local libraries or from home, courtesy of their own local library. Today we're on Gadigal land, and as we gather to share stories and knowledge, let us reflect on the rich history of storytelling in this place. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any First Nations people in the audience today. And a couple of practical details. If you've been to any other sessions, you've probably heard these before, but please ensure that your phones are switched off to silent or in your bag. We don't want any interruptions with today's events. Also, don't record the session, but please, if you are taking photographs, turn off your flash and feel free to share those on social media at Bad Crime Sydney, or one word, or with the hashtag Bad Crime Sydney 22. Now, in the unlikely event of an emergency, we will leave through the door that you've entered and exit the building via the Mitchell vestibule main doors and down the front stairs to an assembly point in the domain. Our security guards will direct you, so please just follow their instructions. Now, my name is Andy Muir, and I'm really quite excited about this panel and being here today in the Dixon room. Today we'll be talking to Benjamin Stevenson, Pamela Hart and Sue Williams. We'll be talking for about 45 minutes. And at the end, we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes for chats and questions. So to kind of kick things off, I was kind of thinking that, you know, in sort of these kind of confusing times when sort of the Queen dies, sometimes we don't want to read a dark crime fiction tale. Sometimes our crime fiction tends to be competing for the highest body counts, the most violent, or the unique method of murder. And sometimes you just want to read something a little different. So today we have 3 books that are definitely falling into that little area of difference. So Benjamin Stevenson on the stage here, he's written 2 of our more serious crime fictions before this one, Greenlight and Either Side of Midnight. But his latest is Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone, which is kind of explaining the plot in the title, which is quite clever. So we'll be able to talk with that one a bit more.
I don't know if it fits your low body count requirement, though, unfortunately.
No, but, you know, there's kind of, I was thinking of Karen Slaughter when I was writing that, and some of those crimes are quite sort of gruesome. But anyway, in the middle we have Sue Williams, whose book Death at the Belvedere is her 4th Cass Tuplin mystery. As well as being the unofficial town private investigator, Cass runs the local fish and chip shop, which has also provided many of the titles for the earlier mysteries. In this one, Cass is talked into helping her sister after the death of her boyfriend, and it involves a unique copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. And then to my left, we have Pamela Hart. Pamela has an exhaustive back catalogue of historical fiction, but she turned to crime with Digging the Dirt, which introduced us to Poppy McGowan. The follow-up is An A-List for Death, which continues Poppy's misadventures. Now, these are all fantastic reads, so I hope that you'll rush out after this session and collect them. But the thing about researching and sort of working up this session was that there seems to be a bit of a bias about books that are lighter. They get called cozy crime, which I don't know whether any of you have an opinion about that.
I do.
Yeah.
For me, cozy crime is more an American thing. It's quite saccharine.
And often has a Z.
Sorry?
It's often cozy with a Z.
It's cozy with a Z.
It tells you it's American.
And it's small town, but not Sue's kind of small town. It's, you know, the kind of Hallmark movie small town. And people do occasionally call my books cozy crime, but I prefer to think of them as classic whodunits, which is a phrase that seems to have fallen out of favor, but we should bring it back.
We definitely should.
We definitely should, yeah.
And I have an opinion about cozy crime as well,
right?
Which I agree with Pamela. And I kind of wanted to take it and make it a little bit more Australian, because you don't seem to really do it so much here. Yep. So I wanted to take that saccharine American stuff and grime it up.
Yeah.
And
make it funny.
Make it funny. Put it into a dusty town instead of a pretty town, And instead of cats, because there's usually cats and chocolate.
Yeah, cats and librarians.
And craft. There must be craft and
Yep.
recipes at the back of the book.
So I thought instead of cats, we could have ferrets.
Yes, the ferrets are
And
excellent.
instead of chocolate, we could have takeaway.
Chico rolls.
I think as well, you know, both of your books, they're also really good mysteries. I think that cozy crime, with the quotation marks, you know, these really quick, they're sort of like Mills and Boon crime novels, where the mystery is not the most important part. People read it for the will they, won't they romance, or the charming elements, or the cutesy bits, which is all fine. But I think when we put humor into our books, we're overlaying it on top of a serious mystery that can stand up with the best whodunits. And then we're adding charm and humor instead of going the other way, in which you sort of tilt into sort of farce or overly humorous. And I think that's the difference in Australian cozy at the moment.
Yeah, and that's really you're kind of stealing my material for later, but
Sorry about that.
I read your notes before we came in.
Yeah. See, this is why you don't leave things lying around. But that's the really sort of strong thing about these books, is that they are really finely sort of structured. They really understand the kind of tropes and rules of crime fiction, but then they just sort of have, you know, the comedy over the top, as you say. Were you sort of always crime readers?
Yes. Trixie Belden. Love Trixie Belden, read everything, all of those Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew. Discovered Agatha Christie when I was about 10 and kept going from there. Yeah. So huge Dorothy Sayers fan, you know, the Lord Peter Wimsey books, just for sheer beautiful writing.
I'm a big fan of, you know, Sherlock Holmes. I read a lot of Sherlock Holmes growing up. But also, I think crime filters in ways that you don't expect. The first 3 Harry Potter novels are crime novels.
Yep,
They've got twist endings, they've got hidden criminals, you know, and so that kind of stuff, I think, really built into my reading taste as a child.
And I was a big fan of Agatha Christie as a child, so it's pretty hard to, you know, get better than Agatha, really.
Yeah.
And
The
Raymond
plots are
Chandler.
incredibly tight.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah.
When you look at the novels aren't very long. They're shorter than contemporary novels because typewriters. But the plots are really, really tight. And she always plays fair. Even with Roger Ackroyd, she plays fair. But so heavily plotted. And then in a sense, character dropped in on top of that, I suspect.
And because that's, I mean, crime fiction is a really tricky genre because there are so many rules and you kind of need to know them, and your audience knows them so well. Adding comedy sort of seems to just add another layer of difficulty. I mean, how do you sort of approach that? I mean, are you sort of thinking of funny situations, or are you sort of writing your crime?
I didn't know I was making it funny until the reviews came out.
Yeah.
And then the second book, you know, my editorial feedback was, the first one was funnier, make it funnier. And I'm going, I don't know how I did it in the first place, you know.
Yeah.
So,
I get less jokes. A lot of people are dying. Is my feedback. Tone it down. Have someone, I think in the middle of the book, have someone pause and reflect on the fact that their significant other just died for 200 words. And I'm like, all right. But I think the situational stuff, I mean, no situational stuff in my book is funny. It's a real plot. Yeah. The humor comes from the perspective of the characters and the way in which they interact with the world, the way in which any Australian person, you know, we deal with stuff so blackly. So if you are in that situation where you're locked in a hotel with a serial killer stalking you, you know, there are those funny moments that are understated, and that's how people deal with those kind of things that I think makes it actually more genuine rather than forcing jokes or situation in. Yeah. It's more the eyes that you're looking at it through, which adds.
It's always character. I mean, that's.
I think character, yeah. And for me, the comedy is not actually around the crimes themselves. It's more about the characters. And for me, there's a lot of family humor. So Cass, the main character, her eldest son is a cop, and he totally disapproves of her being this amateur investigator. He says an unlicensed investigator is basically just a stalker mum. You know? So there's a lot of, for me, a lot of the humor is in the family stuff. Yeah. But the actual crimes themselves are not. I'm not really trying to have us laugh at those. They're pretty serious.
Because it is sort of, it's more that sort of observational, isn't it?
Yeah.
And
it's how the character reacts to everything around them.
Yeah.
and you have to pick what they react to, I guess, to make sure that you're being respectful of the dead.
Yeah, because if you're not sort of doing that, as you said earlier, like it becomes farce.
Yeah, which is a totally valid, genre itself. But I like to see it as the difference between the Maltese Falcon and the Falcon Malteser.
Do you sort of, I mean, there's been funny or lighter sort of crime novels since the year dot, but it does feel that Richard Osman's success has really kind of changed the landscape. Have you sort of found a more receptive with your publicists and publishers and that since then?
No.
I think I've detected in my publisher a desire to kind of be included within Richard Osman. So, because there's a big stack of his books in the shops and they're selling. My book, which was originally called To Grill a Mockingbird, had its title changed to Death at the Belvedere with a nice little platypus on the front, which Benjamin very kindly pointed out does look a little bit like Richard's book. So
just the animal.
My publisher has gone the whole hog, and there's a little thing on the cover that says, "For lovers of Richard Osman's The Thursday Murder Club." So we're not even pretending not to ride that wave.
It's so weird about your title, Sue, because my original title was Everyone in My Family Has Grilled Someone, but we changed it so as not to clash with yours. I certainly think, it broke it open. I was writing this book before The Thursday Murder Club came out. And, my publishers have been incredibly supportive. There's a lot of sort of metafictional elements to my novel as well, and stuff that maybe at an early synopsis stage when I was trying to explain what I was trying to do, they had a lot of faith in me, but I wasn't 100% sure it would work until I finished it. And then The Thursday Murder Club came out. I'm about halfway through the book, or, I was getting really into the book. And then we had the conversation of, well, I reckon you should finish it because I think this genre is really cracking at the moment. So it's just good timing, I think. Yeah. But it's always been around, and it's really great that a couple of those big things happened at the same time. I would put Knives Out, the film, in that category as well. And it really made the space for, especially for me, it was very COVID driven. It was, I don't want to sit in my room and write about death when, we don't know what the world sort of looks like. How can I write something fun that's enjoyable and an escape to what we don't know is happening at the moment?
What I found interesting is, I wrote before COVID, Digging Up Dirt was written before COVID, but what I have found really interesting is the number of emails I've got from people saying, I couldn't read. I just couldn't read anything. I couldn't concentrate on anything. And then I picked up Digging Up Dirt and I zipped through it. Yep. And thank you for returning me to reading, which is very, it's a big thing for an author to get an email like that. But it was surprising how many there were who went, I just needed something. I needed an escape, and people talk down about escapist fiction, but it's actually a great gift to give someone if they're in need of kind of a break from the hard life. It's a great gift to give them.
No, it is sort of, especially in these sort of crazy times, that sort of need to have that release. I just wanted to go back to sort of something you said, Ben, that the sort of the conscious decision not to kind of write about death, and then you kind of have this high body count in your book.
Yeah, well, not about because I didn't want to not write a crime novel. And obviously death is important in it. And the title of the book implies that there will be at least 7 murders because it's structured around each family member and who they've killed, and then the overarching mystery of the serial killer. But the tone of the murders, my second book was quite dark, and it was sort of a rip from the headline story about some quite dark stuff. And I just wanted to move away from that. Somebody left me a Goodreads review which said, I really enjoyed this book, but this guy needs a mental health review. And I was like, I'm going to write something lighter, I think. So I think recognizing the body count, but it's also about, if we take it back to Christie and Holmes and Sayers and Knox and stuff, the pleasure of these golden age mysteries in which we build on is that the good guys win. That's right. The evildoer, the victim is often deserved, not necessarily in all our books, but the victim is often deserved. And justice is done to the people who did it to them. Yep. And you leave the book feeling quite nice, regardless of how traumatic the journey is or how many people sort of kick the bucket. You leave the book feeling good. Whereas modern psychological thrillers, which is a great feeling to end a book on, but they leave you thinking, the end of Gone Girl, you're just like, oh my God, So that's the real difference
Yeah.
in the way in which you construct
And
these mysteries.
that's reinforced by the fact that you can keep the gore off the page.
Yeah, my
in
murders are super grisly. It's an
It's-
ancient Persian torture technique that the serial killer applies, and
But
it's
then you discover it. We don't experience it with the victim, which you often do in the modern serial killer books. You know, you're often in the victim's point of view as they're being killed. Which
and
is
it's not
really
lingering on the autopsy table
Yeah.
and you know all these kind of
And
things
that's
that are
because
in
they're
other
more
books.
mysteries. What I think,
It's all about
as
the
Pamela
puzzle.
said, we've written
Yeah.
things that are more mysteries, more puzzles.
Yeah.
And I think I've sometimes been asked, why do you write crime? And I'll turn that to the questioner and say, why do you read crime? And I think the answer is that perhaps people reading crime and maybe writing crime are really looking for a kind of sense of justice or something like that, that they're bothered by injustice in the world. And I've just realized if I hold it a little closer, you can hear me. I hope you've been hearing me.
Say,
If you tilt it,
Yeah.
as well, it'll come through.
Sayers reckon that crime fiction was the most noble of all fiction because it strove for justice, because we ended up with justice achieved and social the social network reestablished.
And again, not all of our characters do this
No.
in our modern books, but the detective is also quite infallible in those old-fashioned books. I know Sherlock Holmes is a coke addict, but he's not the same as the brooding detective who lingers over a divorce and a glass of whiskey in the New York bar. You know, that's a very different style of detective, and they are infallible, and their sort of personal backstories don't impact the plots that they are in, which is another key sort of element. There's that pinnacle that you can sort of go, well, I have faith in Poirot. I understand, which was the biggest problem with the Death on the Nile film, is they made him really brooding and they gave him a backstory. And it was like, you don't need this.
Yeah, I hate backstory. I think it's like a sex scene. It gets in the way of the narrative.
Skip all the flashbacks in my book. Then.
But I was also sort of wondering whether there'd been any sort of challenges about writing, you know, murder in a sort of lighter tone. Was there sort of audiences or feedback from readers that sort of are uncomfortable with the idea of
No, readers love it. I think judges of prizes don't put it up there. You know, you've got to be a bit grim to get. Well, I don't know you, right? But the
As Robert Gott, I don't know if
Yeah.
people are familiar with Robert Gott, lovely guy,
Yeah.
and he writes some lighthearted crime novels as well as some more serious ones. And he said to me once that he was told by, I think, a judge, the reason he wasn't winning awards is because comedy is easy. And he just did that face, easy. And I thought, how can you say comedy is easy?
That's
Like, it's
not-
actually quite difficult to
Yes.
to get it right. So I don't know, maybe judges are often people who just want to cry.
Yeah, they want.
I mean, outside of the prize discussion, I think it's quite interesting when you publish a book that pertains to be clever,
Yeah.
right? I think the Australian gut instinct is to go, and I know this from being a stand-up comedian for 15 years, right? If you tell someone you're funny, they're like, my first goal is to prove you wrong. They're not like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, cool, we'll see if you're funny. It's like, you're not funny and you have to prove to me you're funny. And so when you say that this book is clever, they'll be like, we'll see.
I would never. It's really interesting because my instinctive reaction is, oh, I would never say it was clever. I might say it was lighthearted or a good mystery or something, but I would never, because of that instinctive kind of, oh, really? Oh, you're clever, are you? Okay.
Well, I mean, I'm not walking around going, my book's clever.
No,
You know, whatever's in the marketing or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I have an instinctive kind of Australian, oh, no, I wouldn't say that. And it is clever. Your book is very clever. But I can understand that you might get a reaction to that.
But I think that's often the response to just comedy in general. I think from the stage perspective, you know, it's you've got to prove to the audience. It's not the other way around. If you go into a theater and you sit and you watch a Broadway musical, you're expecting it to be good, and then you might change your mind if it doesn't deliver. But if you go into a comedy show, you're expecting it to be bad and you are waiting to be proven right. And it's a different hill to sort of climb, which is a fascinating challenge to sort of take on as a writer.
I guess the advantage we have though is that we're offering something else as well as comedy. You know, I wouldn't say these are minor comic books. They're mysteries that have a few laughs in them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all would say that.
Yeah, and I think we're not particularly flagging that they're funny.
Closer to comic books because Cass is such a character. You know, she's one of those characters that that rushes to things and makes great conclusions that puts her into weird situations. And
Absolutely.
you know.
She's a terrifying person. I would not want to be around her. I did once work for somebody who was a little like that. If we're going to talk about inspiration for characters, but are we going off topic here?
No, it's free flowing.
Yeah. So Cass was sort of loosely based on a boss I had. I was an internal auditor at a hospital, and the director of the hospital thought that some building materials might have been going missing, and so we had to kind of trail this guy. We had to wait outside his apartment at in the dark, it's freezing cold. It's in the north of England, and then follow this guy all around and she was heavily pregnant, my boss. She was so eager to do this, and I'm like, anything could happen. No. And then we followed him up this one-way street, and he in his blue van, and he pulled over and he came over and he bashed on the window, and it turned out he was the wrong guy. So that is kind of Cass's world, but it's not my world.
It writes itself.
Yeah.
But the idea of the amateur sleuth is very useful, isn't it? It sort of allows you to sort of make mistakes and
it does. But I think if you're in a series, there's a limit to how many dead bodies someone can trip over without it starting to feel quite odd, And I'm a big Jessica Fletcher fan from Murder, She Wrote, but if I would never invite her to anything that I was putting on, because everywhere that woman goes, someone dies.
You never get married on Neighbours. That's the rule. Yeah.
That's it.
And the big challenge with an amateur detective is they have to have an excuse to be doing this.
Yes.
And I think you've done that really well, because it's the family, isn't it? So, perfect excuse. We're all related to each other.
And also driven by the background.
Well, the commitment to the investigation needs to be there. I mean, I like amateur sleuths because it cuts down on research, because he can pick up a gun and he's like, this is a gun and it shoots bullets. And that's fine, because that's all I know about guns. So that's why I do it.
Yeah.
And Pamela's as well, because it's a kind of almost like it is a family connection, isn't it? She's got perfect
not the first
excuse.
one, but the second one. Yes, the second one, there's a family kind of connection. I do have plans for the future, so it won't seem so odd for her to be, kind of tripping over corpses. But that's a secret. You'll have to read the books that come out. But yeah, I think I do think there's a point, and this is one of the problems with the cozy mystery series from America, is that these people are corpse magnets, and yet nobody ever talks about it. Nobody ever talks about the fact that this is like the 17th dead person you've found in this tiny little town of 200 people, right? And I think that's stretching your reader's credibility too far. So you do have to be careful about how they get involved with the investigation and, that kind of thing.
If I might offer a counter to that, I think I agree that it's a real challenge when you're putting sequels and you've got to have them stumbling upon bodies. But it's also sort of invisibly agreed with the reader at some point. Can you weigh that realism with their want for that character to come back? And you've got to balance that equation however you want to balance it, and it can tilt either way. But me personally, as a reader, I can sort of jump over that if it's the characters that I love and they get pulled into the mystery.
And that's kind of a nice little segue into that sort of the metafiction of your book, which is, do you want to explain metafiction? Because it's sort of, it's quite...
Yeah, sure.
Because, what's the difference between metafiction and an unreliable narrator?
And beg your pardon?
An unreliable narrator.
Oh, so metafiction, the way I describe it is it's a book that knows it's a book. So it's a piece of art that is consumed in a way in which it knows the way in which it's consumed in the real world, right? And the other way I describe it is it's exactly the same as postmodernism, but when you tell your sales and marketing team you're writing a postmodern novel, they're like, ugh. And when you say I'm writing a metafiction novel, they're like, oh, that sounds good. And it's exactly the same. But so it's a book. My book is a book that knows it's a book. The person that writing it has sat down and written the events and is aware that you are reading words that he's written down. Can I read a bit from the first page, which sort of sums it up? So this is what I mean by metafiction. Call me a reliable narrator. Everything I tell you will be the truth, or at least the truth as I knew it to be at the time that I thought I knew it. Hold me to that. For I'm both Watson and detective in this book, where I play both writer and sleuth, and so I'm obligated to both light upon clues and not conceal my thoughts. I'll prove it. If you're just here for the gory details, deaths in this book happen or are reported to have happened on page 14, page 46, page 65. There's a twofer on page 75 and a hat trick on page 81. Then there's a bit of a stretch, but it picks up again on page 174, page 208-ish, page 218, page 227, page 249, somewhere between page 243 and page 250. It's hard to tell. 262 and page 355. I promise that's the truth, unless the typesetter mucks with the pages. There is only one plot hole you could drive a truck through. I tend to spoil things. There are no sex scenes. So that is, the narrator is aware that he is telling you a story that he's written down, and he's referring to the events in the book as if he is writing them down. So you've got sort of three levels: the events of the book, the act of him writing the book, and the act of you writing the physical book as well.
Except when you're reading the ebook, as I did, those page numbers are useless to me.
No, you would have got a PDF. It's got three different versions.
No, I bought the ebook.
Oh, it's got chapter references, not page numbers in the ebook. So I wrote three different versions. There's an ebook version and there's an audiobook version. In the audiobook, he chastises you for listening to it on an audiobook. And in the ebook, he chastises you for being cheap and buying a cheaper version. Just because I thought it was funny. So there are three different versions of the book.
Okay.
I was going to ask, with these characters, did they sort of take on a sort of life of their own? I mean, was there one that you sort of had to pull back, that sort of getting too big and dominating things? Or
a lot of the people in my books are actual people, like my friends are in there.
Right. That's a little dangerous.
And your publisher's okay with that?
Consulting, it's all consulting. And so
You're friends with an international rock star?
It's actually, well, not
and an
exactly
archaeologist,
but it is my Auntie Pauline's best friend's son is, and so I
is Harry Styles. Okay, got it.
That, that bit older than that. This is, but so I can't bet, I can't pull them back. Obviously, they have to be themselves, and I consult with them. They read the book before it's published and edited and all that. And I said to my friend Ron, whose idea it was that I write crime in the first place, what do you want? And he went, give me my hair back. Because he's bald now. But he had beautiful red hair when he was young. And my friend Vicky wanted to be taller. And, so we negotiated all of that. But I can't pull them back too hard because they wouldn't be them.
Mine are made up, I hope, I believe.
You have to say the villains are all made up. Okay.
But they do take over. Cass takes over. In fact, if I'm struggling with plotting, because I do find plotting quite difficult, I'm a bit of a pantser style of writing. I just put Cass and her son Brad into a room together, and they whinge to each other about how useless this writer is and how they're just going to have to write this book themselves. And often that is when it comes out. Yeah, maybe I should turn it into metafiction, use those scenes. And so that's them taking over in a very useful way.
Yeah.
Ernest's interior monologue is sort of my interior monologue. So when he sort of points something out on the page and says, this is happening right now, that's sort of what I'm thinking while I'm writing the scene. And then I sort of pull from bits of places. They're more parts of me. I have an identical twin brother, and he's not too happy with how he holds up in all my novels. Brothers don't seem to go all that well. And he's started to suspect there's some kind of Freudian undertone to something there. But aside from that, yeah, I just sort of imagine it. But as I said before, I pull the humor of Ernest down. I try and make them, it's the theatricality of comedy. That the countering the comedy is easy. So you got to go big, and then you got to pull it back to find where the real line is. And so often I do pull him back if he's a bit overbearing.
Yeah.
I had to reassure my sisters that they were not the sisters in the book.
I've had to reassure a cousin. I've got a cousin called Jeanette, and she is insistent that the ferret called Jeanette is based on her. Like, really? Who even reads that kind of thing in a ferret? How?
I don't think my family reads my books because I don't get any of those messages.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions about my books, but it was kind of people identifying things that they'd said or done, which I kind of subconsciously
would be a bit difficult almost everybody in your books are criminals, except for the police, and some of the police are criminals. So
yes,
you don't want people going, is that me? Because it's like, really? You do that stuff?
Yeah, there was a little bit of that. But the worst, sorry, I won't talk about my books. Let's move on to the I had another question about the idea of, like, with Australian crime fiction, we sort of are fascinated with, the detective going to the rural town. And these books, they're playing with it or they're not doing it at all. Ben, you've kind of set yours in the ski fields. You've got there's this kind of remote Victorian country town, but close enough to get to the city. And then we also have inner Sydney with your work.
Yep.
Was that a kind of conscious decision to play
It
with that?
wasn't mine. Australians are city people, or we're coastal people. And I did want to kind of move away from that American small town thing because I've never lived in a small town. It's that right what you know. I grew up in Western Sydney, and now I live in the inner west. And I came to writing these books out after writing historical fiction, which was so research heavy, like incredibly World War I, 1920s, huge amount of research. And I just didn't want to do any. So I just used the places that I knew, but also because I wanted to read crime fiction set in my world. And I think a lot of us do that. We want to read about the places we know. I get a lot of feedback. Oh, it's lovely to read about,
I loved all the Sydney in your book.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the archaeology it was really interesting.
Yeah, my husband's an archaeologist, which is where all that comes from. That's something else I have in common with Agatha Christie. She said that archaeologists make the best husbands because the older you get, the more interested in you they become.
Mine was fairly deliberate because I started with the conundrum, which is that sort of classic golden age impossible murder. And my conundrum was a man who's died in a fire but is found in a field of unmelted snow. So that sort of fed into the setting. I also, grew up cross-country skiing around Jindabyne and stuff, so I sort of knew the area. And I was very aware that a lot of other people's books, are set in rural country towns. My first book was down the coast. My second book was. And so I was like, I'm going to write one at the snow. And I didn't tell anybody it was set at the snow until it was just about to be published, until we sort of had a cover and anything. Not because I was worried people would take it, but just because I thought that voicing it, I'm like, this is just for me for now, and then hopefully I could do the snow book sort of on my own a little bit. Yeah,
and it allowed the isolation.
Well, yes, of course, there's all those elements that you need to pull in, that the stranded in the snowstorm, the phones not having reception, that you need for the kind of mystery that I was writing as well. But yeah.
And for me, Cass lives in Rusty Bore because all my family live in somewhere a little like Rusty Bore, and I'm there a lot. And I thought, if I'm doing these long drives from Melbourne to this place, I need to use this in some way. But she comes to Melbourne in this book because her sister lives in Melbourne. So it's very much driven by the characters. And I guess because I'm not planning it as I go, that would have been a much better idea to have started with a sort of a very specific scene, I guess, like you have, and then you can write the book around that. That would be quite helpful. But for me, it's just lurching from one kind of idea to the next.
When
you never know who the murderer is. No idea while I'm writing it.
When you use a small setting, I often find the trouble is, I'm like, God, I wish they could go to Melbourne and just figure, oh, what a convenient phone call with the forensic report, that normally your character could just go where you need them to go to get that extra bit of backstory information. And so often I run into that plotting as well. And I'm like, God, I wish I set this somewhere they could leave.
Yeah, we're kind of talking about, something completely different, and like that sort of setting is sort of something completely different to other sort of crime fiction that's sort of happening. But the sort of the remoteness of both of your books kind of then sort of also plays into that sort of golden age, the no mobile phone, sort of those problems that we sort of you don't have to explore or deal with.
The classic country house in the flood kind of story. Everything's cut off, and yeah.
Well, yeah, and Ernest makes jokes about how soon people's phones will run out of battery. And so every time someone picks up their phone, on the page, it tells you the battery percent that they have left, because he knows that at some point they're going to get trapped there. And also, they're not actually trapped. A group of people leave halfway through the book, and everyone in the book's like, no, we'll stay and solve the mystery. Like, they're not really trapped. So it's a joke about being trapped as well, on top
trapped
of it
in
being
the family.
Well, yeah, trapped by their own curiosity, really, while also being an extremely handy setting to have a series of murders.
And it's kind of interesting, again, sort of going back to that golden age detective fiction, like the structures are kind of very, very rigid. We sort of know this is kind of how the story plays out, but they're all quite different. And then to sort of have the references to the list of what, Knox's list of rules. And there's so many kind of crime fiction writers that have produced these lists of rules. Have you ever kind of consulted them in your work to sort of help you out of a plot problem?
Only one real rule, and that is play fair with the reader.
Right.
So if the reader is paying attention to everything that happens, they should get to the solution of the murder at about the same time as Poppy does. So I don't, whatever she knows, they know, I think is my rule. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd probably go with that approach because it's a first person narrative too with Cass. So the reader is finding things out as she does.
Same time.
A little bit different to Ernest because it's kind of being told as she experiences it rather than the idea of her writing it afterwards. So yeah, so I think I kind of would go with that idea that playing fair, that Cass doesn't withhold information from the reader.
Of course, the character might come to a different conclusion than the reader does at the time. Particularly if you're a really suspicious reader, as many are, like I am, then you might go, oh, I bet that's about such and such,
And that's the great challenge for crime writers, that obfuscation that you have to do, because crime readers are incredibly suspicious people and they've usually read a lot of it before. Yeah. I bet people who write romantic comedy don't have to experience this, do they?
Oh, yes, they do.
Really?
Yeah. It's a different set of tropes, but they're just as strong. Sorry, I write romance as well. Not rom-coms, but no, the rules are different rules, but they're absolutely rules. Yeah. And again, it's all character-based. In the end, it's all about the characters.
Well, Knox's rules. So for those that don't know, Ronald Knox, who was a contemporary of Agatha Christie, wrote down 10 rules for detective fiction, which he called his 10 Commandments. And they're all very basic. He's just put into words what every writer sort of knows as a vibe. And I didn't know the rules until I started researching this book and wanted it to really live in that golden age and put them in the front of it. But I didn't know the rules, but reading them, you're following all of them. Yeah. It's stuff like you've got to introduce the killer pretty early. Don't hide stuff from the readers. No identical twins unless you flagged it early in advance. Again, play fair. But so it's more like the vibe around it. And lots of other people have written rules as well, which sum it up. But his was sort of the cleanest and the best, which is why I use them.
Yeah. It's interesting when, I don't know whether all of you have taught writing before, but often, the kind of sort of newer writers are kind of looking for those rules and kind of wanting to be sort of told, well, what do I do? But it's almost kind of instinctive, one of these rules.
It is for some people. And other people, because I do teach writing a lot, my other job, and some people who've never heard of a 3-act structure, for example, or who are not analytic readers. Like some people are analytic readers, and I suspect we all are, but some people aren't, and they just consume and enjoy or don't enjoy. And I love those people because they're my favorite readers. But when those people come to write, giving them a 3-act structure percentage, first act ends at 25%, blah, 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 that can actually help them enormously. And then they develop those instincts over time as they write and rewrite and write the second book or whatever. But no, there's no one right way to write. But for some people, the rules are really helpful. Yeah, and they end up with great stuff. It's just another way of getting there.
I think we consume so much content these days, books, films, television, that we're so attuned to narrative structures that when you consume something that doesn't quite adhere to what you expect, it can often make you feel like you're not quite sure why you're uncomfortable or why it's not hitting the way that you expected it to hit, just as a viewer. And unless the person knows that they are subverting the structures and they know that you're putting you off guard, then they don't know how to get you back on. So that's the real key of understanding the structure, because you should be able to break it and move it around as much as you like, but you've got to understand what you're moving, and that's what happens when the reader is consuming it. They're like, I feel weird here and I don't know why, and then the twist comes and they're like, oh, we were, this was happening the whole time, and that's why I didn't feel like it was happening the way I expected.
And years ago, I did a writing course and learned about the 3-act structure. And that has just totally destroyed film watching for me now, because I now can see all those points.
My first degree is in television and film production, so was ruined for me right from even before. But no, see, I love it. I love the fact I watch with like 2 levels. Anything I read with 2 levels, I watch with 2 levels, and one level is going, oh, I see what they're doing there, and the other level is going, don't open that door. And I'm happy to keep both of them going at the same time. Whereas my sister won't go to the movies with me at all, ever again, because she doesn't want to know. She doesn't even want to talk about it afterwards. So she's one of those instinctive readers. And,
right.
Yeah.
Well, it's come to the point where we can sort of open up to some questions from the floor. So I hope you've all been thinking of some tricky questions to put our writers through their paces. Have we got anyone who wants to kick things off? And also, down the back.
Oh, thank you. Do I need to repeat it for Zoom? So we've just been asked if we're going to hear more from the Cunningham family, which is the family, and everyone in my family has killed someone. So I'm writing a sequel now. It will follow, without spoiling, some of the surviving characters, with Ernest finding himself embroiled in a new mystery where he goes somewhere and someone dies and he sort of has to piece it together. And he's very aware that it's a sequel and that all sequels suck. So he's sort of talking about
Second
that
books
through.
are hard.
Yeah. And I've actually got at the moment, I've put at the start of every, this will be news to my publisher who's in the audience, the start of every chapter I have body count and then the number of people who've died so far, just so you can keep track of who's dying. But I'll probably take it out by the time the book's published.
Is he going to have a stage where he gets blocked? That's that idea that the second novel, the writer gets blocked.
Oh, he gets writer's block?
Yeah.
Well, maybe. I mean, I'm a bit him and I'm a bit writer's block, so it's probably quite useful. But yes, he'll be back.
In terms of the differences between straight crime and crime with comedic elements, obviously the big differences are tone and delivery. Plots themselves, are there key differences or core differences, between writing a straight crime and a crime with comedic elements that you would adhere to in writing one or the other, or are they interchangeable?
I think the plots are the same. What varies in terms is structural terms is what you put on the page. So you might have the same plot, but with a lot more gore on the page, for example, the actual killing on the page or whatever. But the pacing and the plotting have to be pretty much the same, I think. And it's just the character's take on what's going on that makes it lighthearted. That's where you get your tone from.
And I think often what drives, for me anyway, the crimes is not so much the whether it's comedic or not, it's the location. I think locations can often influence the kind of crime that might, or the way in which the crime occurs. So, if it's in a rural location.
It's about how you feel about the location though, isn't it? Because in Australia, you've got the rural noir stuff where the landscape is perceived by the writer as well as some of the characters as inimical. It's perceived as dangerous and dark. So I think it's about how your main character perceives the location also gives you some of that tone.
I guess that's true. I suppose for me, though, it was more, I was just thinking about the crime that I had in my first book, Murder with the Lot, which is set very much rural and a lot of stuff's going on at this very isolated Salt Lake where you don't have mobile coverage. You are quite cut off, and there was a dust storm as well. So the sort of things that go on there versus in Death at the Belvedere, which is much more set in the city. So it involves, a guy being pushed off the balcony of an apartment, rooftop balcony. So it's kind of I think the crime, or maybe the way in which you kill people, that might be what I'm trying to drive at. The way in which you kill your people varies according to the location rather than whether it's a comedy or not.
I think I'll take a slightly contrary stance again on this, because I think that what all our books are mystery novels that homage to the golden age of mystery novels. And in that sense, they have to be exactly the same plots. And the reason it comes across as charming or quaint or even comedic before you even get to the voice or the jokes that you're putting is that we see the 1930s as charming and quaint. So we sort of put that in our heads when we're and our books aren't set back then, but you sort of see the detective smoking the pipe, and that sort of has an impression on you that it builds. When you talk about not proper, because again, I think our books are mysteries and not comedy crime. When you go into comedy crime, if you move along other genres, then yes, you do have different plots, because then you've got the buddy cop comedy or something, versus the cop drama, which are very different. So it spreads out depending on what you're doing. But if you're doing the golden age, then I think the mystery has to be exactly the same as a golden age mystery.
Jane Hadley via Zoom would like to ask the panel, what is your greatest fear in writing light-hearted crime books?
That they'll be shit.
I think that's the fear in writing anything, though, that everything you're writing is shit, and you've got to sort of try and somehow deal with the despair and create a little bubble of self-belief around yourself to get through that first draft. And then you can worry about whether it's shit in the second draft.
Third draft. It's like when I'm nothing seems original because I've read it so many times, and you think never going to a bookstore at that point, because you go, look at all these books, but who am I to think that the world needs this book? It's like I can't go into bookstores at that point. My husband's also a writer. Yes, the archaeologist also writes, and he's very good at kind of patting my hand and going, it's fine, it'll be fine, it's a good book, but there's always a moment somewhere along the line where you go, whoops.
Well, and especially jokes are only funny the first time you hear them.
Oh, yes.
So when you're sifting through your draft and you're thinking, what do I cut and what do I keep? Nothing's funny. Yeah. And it's the same as, I'm sure when you're plotting, it's the same as, oh, my killer is so obvious. This clue gives it away. And it's actually a good part of the book, but you can't see it for the trees. So that's probably the hardest bit is what's funny.
How do you manage that? I didn't even sort of thought, because it's exactly right. When you're kind of reading your manuscript for the 10th, 12th, 20th time, it's all tired.
It just comes down to gut and experience, I think, when you're particularly choosing those pieces, but also the humility to understand that even if you love a joke, if 3 people don't get it or think that's not funny, then it's
you got to have other people reading.
Mm.
Yeah. I'll often, back to stand-up comedy, but you go on stage and you're like, I've got this absolutely ripping 5 minutes and it's going to crush and it's my new 5 and this is going to be what I do on telly next year. Like, this is the best. And then you've been booked for a 7-minute spot and you're like, and then I'm winging the last 2. And that 5 absolutely bombs and the last 2 crushes. And you're like, ugh. But you got to go with what the audience is and sort of read them. So,
Shelley Ray via Zoom has a question for the panel. Did you begin your first book with the plan to develop a series?
Not at all. No, for me, it's just one book at a time. I thought Rusty Ball would be hit by a meteor or something like that and disappear. So 4 books on, I'm quite surprised, to be honest. But I guess perhaps there's less pressure that way. If you're planning a series, there might be more pressure from the publisher. Text have been great. They've just allowed me to have the space to do one at a time.
Yeah, I don't start with any particular plan. Because I like it to feel open-ended. I like it to feel like anyone could sort of die or leave the book. And I think if you're sort of invested in a series that you've plotted out, then you sort of don't leave yourself those options to surprise yourself, because you need this relationship to carry through the next book. So I never start off and then each book I sort of think, well, which characters do I need to tell the story that I would like to tell? And sometimes they're returning characters.
Well, I did. Yes. I wrote the first book, Digging Up Dirt, and enjoyed the writing of it so much I immediately wrote the first draft of the second. And I think I did. I wanted a series. Yeah.
Was that a reaction to having written so many historical
It
fictions?
was partly that, but it was partly that the first one was so much fun to write. And I thought I could do this for a really long time, you know, whereas I had kind of got to, I wrote the first one in between two historicals. And the last one was The Desert Nurse, which is about a person who nurses the people from Gallipoli. And it goes all the way through World War I. And I did an enormous amount of quite confronting research. And I came out of that going, I want to write something happy. I want to write something happy. I don't have to research. And I wrote Digging Up Dirt, and it was something happy. I didn't have to research. And then the next historical was 1923 London, in the Charleston scandal, with Fred Astaire and Noel Coward and the Prince of Wales and a whole lot of real people. And that, again, huge amount of research, lots of fun, got to watch all the Fred Astaire movies again, but still huge amount of work. And then writing A-List, I thought, yeah, no, I can see the end to the historical fiction because it's just so much extra work. And they're big books, they're 100,000, whereas these are more 80,000. And I thought, yeah, I could do this for a long time. I should make it a series. So from the beginning.
And just with your work, Sue, if you're sort of doing a book at a time, does that mean that you have to then go back to kind of remind yourself what's in the previous ones because you weren't sort of intending to continue?
I don't know if I really have had to do that consciously. I think the only time I had to do that really was when I wrote the second one, Dead Men Don't Order Flake. And that one begins with Dead Men Don't Order Flake, but that's exactly what Leo Stone asked me for when he walked in through my door. And it turns out that he and Cass have got this whole history and he's the love of her life and blah, blah. And none of that was mentioned in the first book. So I had to sort of go back to the first one to think, can we make this work?
Pietro.
Yes. Yeah, he was
She missed
dodgy.
us terribly.
Yeah, dodgy man.
Sylvia Vargo, also via Zoom, has a question. How many of you were influenced by TV series such as Midsummer Murders or other light-hearted series?
For me, not really. Midsummer Murders is not something I've really enjoyed watching that much. I guess in recent years, I've enjoyed Vera a lot, although I don't know if I'm really influenced by her, but I do love the fact that we've got this sort of quite eccentric middle-aged woman.
Brenda Blethyn is a genius, you know, at being Vera. The Brokenwood Mysteries, not so much being influenced by it. I don't know if people know it. It's from New Zealand, and it's the same format as Vera of an hour and a half. And I love it. And it's a police procedural, but it does have that kind of lighthearted tone and weird characters. And it wasn't so much that it influenced me as that it confirmed that there was a market out there for me, that there were readers who would like the same kind of tone.
The two biggest influences on this book are, there's the whole vibe of the Golden Age and as I said, Christian Holmes, but a movie called Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, which is a neo-noir sort of comedy thriller. And it's not really crime, but it's very snarky and it's very self-aware. And I really like the voice in it. And a novel called The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton, which is sort of a crime, but it's a Regency set. It's more a pastiche of sort of, Jane Austen mixed with some crime, mixed with some time travel. But that book was a real big influence purely for the way in which Stuart Turton swings for the fences at every turn. He never shortcuts and he never compromises any creative risks. There are so many risks in that book and he pulls it off. And so those are the influences that I think fed most into this alongside all the classics, but not so much those TV shows of Midsummer Murders.
Yeah, we've got a question down the front here.
My question's for Benjamin. So I imagine your training as a stand-up comedian, because you have to craft 5 or 7 minute stories, has made you very good at endings. Is that right?
I think that The crafting is one thing that I think I really benefited from doing stand-up comedy, because your word precision has to be really tight. You don't have time to use extra words, or extra words can sort of interfere with your meaning. So it makes your word economy really good, which is terrible for hitting a contractual word count, but really good for making a pacey novel. And then the endings, yeah, absolutely. I mean, comedy is based on surprising people with an unexpected reveal that you've set up, that they don't know that you're setting up. And it's basically just pulling all those threads together. So it's very much the same process. So I do think it helps me a lot with that kind of structure. And the rule of comedy is you've got to say something 3 times before it's funny a 4th time. So it's funny the first time, it's not funny the second time, it's really not funny the 3rd time, and then the 4th time it's very funny. And I use that kind of, not in every joke, obviously, but when you're doing sort of persistent repetition style joke. And I use that in crime with the clues. You got to go 1, 2, 3, bang, there's the reveal. And that sort of is the way in which I structure the ending. So yeah, I think I use it a lot.
I'm taking that away.
Yeah, I'd heard the rule of 3, but I hadn't heard that 4th one. That's interesting.
You got to make it so it's particularly good on red herrings. But yeah, you've got to make it so frustrating that you're doing it again, particularly in comedy. So they're frustrated, and then the outlet is when you do it the 4th time, and they're like, "No, okay, right, that's funny again."
Is there anything in your, because you have a science background, so is there anything in your background that's kind of informed your writing?
I guess the fact that I did a PhD thesis, which is a lot of words, that got me a lot of writing practice. And then I started writing sort of popular science articles because I wanted to be able to share with friends and the world generally the joy of photosynthetic sea slugs. And it surprised me how photosynthetic sea slugs, there's not actually as many people as you'd expect out there interested
I like them.
in photo. Well, thank you, Pamela. Thank you. You're one of the few people I've met who's said that.
I'm actually fascinated by photosynthetic sea slugs.
Okay.
I heard you doing your vocal warm-ups before in photosynthetic sea slugs. Photosynthetic sea slugs.
We can have a little conversation about that afterwards. And then I started to write pieces that I was lucky enough to win a prize in a science essay competition. And Robin Williams, who's no relative, he has the science show on ABC Radio National, and he was kind enough to have me on for a few little pieces. And then I started to write I started to be heading towards comedy, it seemed, because I was writing things about the impact of wind turbines on vampires in South Gippsland and things like that. And I could see I was heading towards fiction, really. But I suppose the science training probably makes you analytical. And maybe that's useful when you come
your
to
descriptions of landscape also, of the detail that you get in, like in your first book, where you're talking about the lake side and the colors, the crust, that seemed to me where that background comes through.
Oh, thanks, Pamela. Yeah, I went to that lake, so that's probably part of it too. Yeah. Yeah, so, and accounting, that's the other thing I've done as a day job. That's definitely influenced me, because as an accountant, you're always observing people and judging them. And you can, and if they've annoyed you, they're going to be very useful, because that's a murder victim, or even the murderer.
It's all about the victim.
Yes.
Do we have one last question? Otherwise, I'll have to sort of wrap it up. So thank you to our panel. If you'd like to put your hands together and